you, Borodah. Will this work with mine? Fingers crossed. It's a great honour to be invited to speak to you. I hope I make a few of you think about not just the small issues here, but some of the bigger issues and how we work with the third world to improve their healthcare in the future, because there are some fundamental issues that underlie the situation at the moment, which I'm hoping to make you more aware of. This is me in the day job. Here's some statistics that you've probably all seen from the Ebola outbreak. Deaths confirmed, probable and suspect, with a total death rate of in excess of 11,000 patients, and total cases in excess of 15,000. 40% death rate, which is actually quite good for Ebola, believe it or not. Previous outbreaks have had fatality rates of up to 90%, but never was there an Ebola outbreak on this scale. Previous outbreaks being numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands of cases and deaths. Tragic though that is, this was unprecedented. Basically, in the healthcare systems that it occurred in, caught everybody with their trousers down, WHO included. And by the time people realised the scale of this event, it was catch up rather than being proactive. I volunteered through UK Med. A call went out. I think most people working in the NHS as clinicians got an invitation to go out to Sierra Leone as part of the UK Med relief operation. I wasn't killed in the rush. Me and my wife both applied. I was taken on, and it was probably one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done. There were some requirements in terms of skill sets, and certainly some personal requirements. I did struggle with a BMI of less than 35, but I was quite surprised by the thoroughness of the medical, making sure you've got a full range of joint movement and could near enough touch your toes, and particularly good range of movement in your shoulders, all of which made sense when I started to do the PPE training, because if you weren't fairly agile, you weren't going to get in and out of the stuff in a safe or reproducible manner. So we turned up at a training camp at the beginning of February 2015. We were split into two groups. I'm in the top group. We went with Save the Children to the Kerrytown Treatment Centre, and the other group of 12 were assigned to a different NGO and a different treatment centre. And they had a really tough time of it. We thought we had it bad, but we were in touch throughout the assignment with them through the wonders of Facebook and WhatsApp and stuff. And we were hearing about the horrific time that they had in a different area. I'll touch on some of the reasons for that as we go along. So we had very thorough pre-deployment training. I think some of the people who went out before us complained a little bit about the standard of the training, but I think they'd obviously learned from that and really got their act together. And I'm sure that Tony will talk more about this in his talk, because I think they really did get a good balance of not only teaching us about the clinical stuff, what we need to know about Ebola, but actually preparing us for the culture and actually the personal culture shock out there. Also, stuff about basic NGO working and personal safety, etc., are all a key part of that. The big daily event for us during this training was a PPE training. We were sort of introduced to PPE. They turned the temperature up in the training room as much as possible. I think they got it up to about 28 degrees. After 10-15 minutes of PPE, we all thought we were going to die. We wondered how the hell we were going to cope. Out in Sierra Leone, where they were telling us the temperatures were 34, 36 on a daily basis with much higher humidity. It's amazing how quickly your body can adapt to those sorts of circumstances. But nonetheless, it was challenging for all of us out on site. So a little bit about Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has a population of about 6.1 million. And the current life expectancy for men is 48, for women is 49, which when you think about it in the context of our life expectancy is pretty awful. It's barely better than our ancient populations statistics from places like ancient Egypt and the ancient Levant, and that's in our current times. This is a country that was recovering slowly but effectively from many years of civil war, 10 years previously. The hotel that we stayed in was a lovely place, newly built. Next to it was a bombed out, burnt out shell of a hotel from the wartime. In fact, there were several of them on the coastline close to our hotel. So I brought it home to just walk on the beach, what had gone on before in Sierra Leone. They estimate there was about 25 qualified doctors in all of Sierra Leone before the outbreak of Ebola. Basically, the health system there is run by nurses and what were termed CHOs, community health officers. 50% of the doctors died in the early part of the epidemic because nobody fully realised what was going on and they were contracting the Ebola without proper protection. And over 500 other healthcare workers died as a result of the lack of protection, lack of organisation, lack of facilities in the early part of the epidemic. And the mortality in healthcare workers was actually far higher overall than it was in the general population. It was in excess of 50%, which probably reflected them being critically exposed with a higher viral load from the outset of their infection. So I don't want to go on too much about Ebola, but basically there are 5 strains of the Yambuku strain that caused the latest epidemic. It's a nasty critter, and in previous outbreaks, as I say, the fatality rate has been up to 90%. So the outcome of this outbreak was perhaps favourable. It does look like we did something right in terms of reducing the fatality rates. It's thought to be carried by the fruit bats, an animal host, and not only is it fatal in humans, it's fatal in other primates as well. Unfortunately, things like fruit bat are endemic in this area of West Africa, and actually part of the local diet. We're talking third world nation where anything that's got meat and nutrition may well be consumed. And these are considered to be a bit of a delicacy. They're ever present in Sierra Leone. We went outside at night whilst we were working in the treatment centre. You had to be careful that you didn't get crapped on by a fruit bat, and they were actually flying around all over the treatment centre. As I say, health workers got a bad time, but what's thought to have been another significant factor in the transmission to ritual burial practices in Sierra Leone, with the families washing the corpse and then splashing the water around so that other mourners were being serially infected by the deceased. And this led to whole families presenting en masse with Ebola subsequent to a family funeral. When I was out there, that was an outlawed practice, but unfortunately was still continuing in some quarters who either hadn't got the message or weren't prepared to accept it. It's basically Ebola is caught from bodily fluids, and the most susceptible areas are your mucous membranes, so eyes, nose and mouth are the areas you've got to be particularly careful with. Damaged skin as well. I went out there thinking I'd have to shave my lifelong beard off in order to wear the PPE, but in fact we were all encouraged to wear beards because if you cut yourself shaving, you weren't allowed in the red zone for at least 3 days. So it all came back pretty beardy, and things like needle stick injuries, etc. Were a constant worry. There was a lot of scaremongering going on around at the time before we went out. There's pictures like this appearing on the internet of supposed Ebola victims. This guy is actually still from some zombie movie. But the reality, it wasn't in fact wasn't particularly less pleasant when you presented with young people in the 3rd stage of Ebola with significant hemorrhage from mucous membranes and probably internally, for whom you could do very little other than try and keep them comfortable and hold their hand, was quite difficult for all of us. And as an intensive care doctor who's used to, rushing in there, sticking a tube in, wheel them around to ITU, give them some fluids, put them on inotropes, You know, I felt very inadequate and very frustrated, really, by the lack of facilities that we had. Without doubt, the thing that made the biggest difference, and I'm not decrying the efforts of all the medical and nursing staff who went out there, but it was the public health message, the cessation of ritual guerrilla practices, education of the public health response, contact tracing, isolation, etc., that really stopped this epidemic. And part of that was obviously the role of the Ebola Treatment Centre, which we'll touch on more. ABC, we just think of, you know, airway breathing circulation, but out there it was avoid bodily contact. I got shouted at a few times for trying to shake hands with people when I first arrived there, because we weren't really supposed to do that. We got into a sort of elbow nudge thing going. But she had PPE on, so it was kind of allowed. So that was your only chance for a hug, really, which many of us needed at times. So a clinical Ebola infection starts off with a fever and a vague range of general sort of viral illnesses or symptoms. So it's actually pretty difficult to pin down to begin with. Then leads on to second stage vomiting, diarrhea, and more serious consequences, leading on to bleeding internally and externally, with death occurring 7 to 10 days after the onset of symptoms. So it could be a protracted death for many of these patients. We would be looking after them for several days in the hope of saving them, but ultimately failing. So this is still at the Carytown Ebola Treatment Centre. First impressions? More like a prison than a hospital. That was my first impression. Big gates and fences around it. And indeed, to some degree, that's what it was. This is an overview aerial photograph of the site. This was erected by the British Armed Forces and led to believe in a period of about 6 weeks. That was previously jungled, a massive feat of engineering, really, to deliver this in the timescale it did, but it was pretty rough around the edges. It was actually divided into 3 areas. There was a general Ebola treatment for the general population, a healthcare worker treatment centre, treatment facility, which was set up by the British government in the hope of providing better care for healthcare workers, both Sierra Leone healthcare workers, but also healthcare workers from other nations who might contract Ebola. So had I contracted Ebola, that would have been my first stopping point, presumably before being repatriated back to the UK. And I have met one anaesthetist who was unfortunate enough to get up the temperature and feeling a bit unwell and a bit of diarrhea, and he ended up in there. It was just a tummy bug, but it was a bit of a scare for him. The big plus for us was that because of the healthcare worker facility, there was also a Public Health England laboratory on site, and we were able to access that for laboratory work, and particularly simple stuff like using these, as well as PCRs for Ebola and malaria. So it was a pretty rough and ready building. It was basically just wooden timber with plastic sheeting over it, and concrete floors. It was the important areas, obviously, what we call the red zone, which is where the infected patients were kept, and that was divided up into several areas for admission and triage. Wards for suspect patients who were being processed to see if they actually had Ebola, which obviously tried to keep those separate from the confirmed patients. So basically, when we went into the red zone, we had a list of jobs that we were expected to do, and it would be one-way traffic. You would go in and you would go first of all into the admissions area as a new patient, then the suspect area, then the wet suspect area, either those patients who had wet symptoms, diarrhea or vomiting, and then from there into the confirmed areas. And you couldn't go backwards through the system, because obviously you could then infect people who didn't actually have the Ebola. It was very hot and humid, and as I say, very hastily constructed. And for us as people working in there, it was a very dangerous environment. We had infected patients, dead bodies to deal with from time to time. Human waste, vomiting, diarrhea was basically just into buckets. The buckets were all over the floor. If you weren't careful, you'd fall over them. We did get patients who get disorientated and aggressive. The last thing you want to do is you just back off, because the last thing you want to do is somebody to pull your mask off, thrashing around in that situation. There were splinters and loose nails sticking out of the woodwork that you could very easily tear your PPE on. The ever-present threat of sharps. And what you didn't really want to do was stay in there for too long if you weren't feeling well. We estimated you would lose at least 2 litres of your body fluid in a 45-minute trip into the red zone. And if you were starting to feel lightheaded or well in any way, you just got out quickly, because getting out wasn't a quick process either. An Australian in a neighbouring treatment centre stayed in too long, fell over, fell unconscious actually, fell against something and injured his back, so they don't have the problem of getting an unconscious, sick, dehydrated guy out with a potential spinal injury, which is a massive risk not only to him but to all the people involved in trying to extract him safely from the red area without contaminating anybody else. Needle stick injury, I had a high fatality in previous outbreaks, so we were quite concerned when one of our colleagues got a needle stick injury 2 weeks into our deployment. I have to say I was very impressed with the UK response. He was flown out in a specially commissioned aircraft, they sent over for her with a full team in PPE and an isolation tent on board, and she was back in the UK within, I think, about 36 hours. She had the full PVP treatment with ZMapp and experimental antivirals, and she, along with the other UK national, did not develop Ebola, thankfully. So what were Ebola treatment centres about? I mean, we're all, you know, as British clinicians, put the patient first, but in this environment, the patient did not come first. The first priority was our safety. I don't think any of us had a problem with that. And the rationale for the treatment centre was, first and foremost, was isolation containment of patients known or suspected of having Ebola. And the second priority was to diagnose Ebola, and the third priority was to treat it. And similarly, our safety and the safety of the general population came before the safety and the treatment of the patient suspected of having Ebola, and that had consequences. In clinical practice, we used to break things down to stage 1, 2 and 3. Stage 1, usually okay, would manage with oral fluids and the survival rate was high, they didn't progress. Stage 2, with the wet scenario of diarrhea and vomiting, we thought was really the clinical battle zone for us. As clinicians, if we thought if we could keep on top of the fluids, keep the patients rehydrated, keep the kidneys working, and we'd have a fighting chance of getting them through this. And then when it went on to stage 3 with evidence of bleeding, often internal bleeding, often accompanied by quite severe pain, often the only thing we could do was administer palliative morphine and try to keep the patient comfortable. No specific treatment, the treatment's all supportive. And basically, if you're going to be successful, it's about fluids, and more fluids. And this was a bit of an issue. I mean, if anybody's come to workshop later, I'll be talking in more detail about what some of the challenges were and how I think we failed a bit miserably, really, in terms of delivering what was really the only worthwhile therapeutic intervention. They all got prophylactic antibiotics to try and prevent secondary infections and a few other bits and pieces. And if we were unfortunate enough to have malaria as well, as some patients did have, then we were able to treat that. But a lot of this was about, you know, planning, getting everything ready for patients in the green area, the preparation area, before you went into the red areas, so you could be in there, be as efficient as possible, do as much as possible, and then be out again in a timely manner for your own safety. But that often included changing patients, cleaning up beds, etc., etc. I'll just leave you to ponder that one, given the publicity around some of the Western casualties, if you like, or cases, relative to the publicity around the thousands of Africans who succumbed. The caseload very much changed during my time. In the early phase of the epidemic, all the patients hitting the treatment centres had confirmed Ebola from a receiving centre. They closed those, so that when I was out there, we had a massive workload with the suspected cases coming direct to the treatment centre. This caused huge problems logistically, not only in trying to keep those patients safe for anything up to 72 hours whilst they were with us, but also in terms of discharging them from the treatment centre, which was time-consuming and very, very complex. And there was, alongside that, a definite second surge in the number of cases of Ebola during that period. When the patients were discharged, they were discharged through what was fondly known as a happy shower. If they were, as this mother and daughter were true cases of Ebola who'd been fortunate enough to survive it, then it probably was quite a happy event. But for some of the suspect cases, it was really quite a difficult and challenging thing. We had at least 5 deaths of patients who'd been admitted, suspected of having Ebola, but proved not to have Ebola, but died while they were in the treatment centre, because we couldn't send them anywhere else. The other hospitals wouldn't receive them until we cleared them of Ebola. So they deteriorated whilst they were in the wrong place and basically not being treated, because we've no idea what was wrong with most of these patients. And if they did survive that, then getting some of these patients out of the treatment centre on stretchers maybe and into another hospital was very challenging, very difficult, and very staff intensive. I think one day we had something like 7 or 8 discharges, and it just took all the staff all day, including the wash staff, etc., to manage that. This was a big team. We were assigned 2 or 3 of the UK Med team to each shift, working alongside 12 local CHOs and nurses and some Cubans. The Cubans had been out there for 5 months at this time, and they'd had a look. They'd had enough. They'd lost one of their team to cerebral malaria, who actually died, and they'd also had 1 case of Ebola in the team, who fortunately survived. There's a massive support structure underneath the clinical teams with admin team, what we call the wash team, water, sanitation, hygiene. They did all the horrible jobs like cleaning up the feces and the vomits, removing the dead bodies, cleaning toilets, etc., etc. They also assisted with the admissions process and also the discharge process. And they were very busy and very organised and well-led team. And only really about a third of the visits into the Red were made by clinical staff. We even had engineers and joiners going in there trying to repair the structure, and they all had to go in PPE as well. So personal protection equipment took you 20 minutes to don it, and it took you about the same length of time to get it off. And it was quite uncomfortable in there. As I say, you could lose 2 to 3 litres of body fluid. You could literally, after some trips in, empty your own body fluids out of your wellies. You could tip a cup or so of water out of there, not to mention that your scrubs would be completely saturated. There was water plenty around the place, and we were encouraged to drink plenty, which obviously we did. But you could have difficulty with breathing if you were wearing 2 masks. One had a valve in that would get stuck with the perspiration and cause difficulties with breathing. And just comfort. I had real difficulty because I wear glasses, trying to get goggles to sit comfortably but tightly over the top of them. Self-awareness was key to this, and working closely in pairs with your buddy and taking care of one another and making sure that PPE was remaining intact, etc., etc. Similarly, the doffing was a complex process. I'm sure we all know the 7-point WHO hand wash. We did that about 7 times during the doffing process after each removal of each piece of equipment and clothing, and some of the removals were quite complicated in order to safely remove, say, your hood. Was quite tricky. So the cost of safety, at its height, there was something like 850 trips per day into the red zone. and I was told that the disposables for each set of PPE cost about £30. So if you do the maths, that's £25,000 a day. So if you wondered where all the relief money was going, this is just a small part of it. Some things like the wellies and the scrubs and the aprons and the goggles were recycled, so we had to clean all those and do it safely and efficiently. And there was this big, massive infrastructure to support the clinical teams in delivering the care. And it was, a self-sufficient site with its own power, sewerage, incinerator, the whole shebang really. So as I say, the treatment, the mainstay was for large volumes of fluid. We were fortunate, we had the public health laboratory next to us. We could get urea next electrolytes, but many of the other treatment centres didn't have the facility to do use these. They could do a PCR for Ebola within about 4 hours, but they couldn't do urea and electrolytes. And that was the case with the other team that were out there. And that's one of the reasons they had a dreadful time. We had the wrong fluids, none of them had an adequate amount of potassium in, and deaths from seizure and sudden collapse in recovering patients were reported right at the outset of the Ebola epidemic. And I'm sure that some of these, the seizures were probably hyponatremic, and the sudden collapses were probably due to potassium imbalance in patients who hadn't had proper management. And to not provide that, given the amount of money that went into this, seems to me to be a massive error. And I think as a result of this, there were unnecessary deaths during this period. Other things that might have helped would be things like fecal management systems, which anyone working on an ITU will be pretty familiar with these days. And actually just something basic like air conditioning, if that could have been provided in the red zone, it would have meant we as clinicians could have stayed in there for far longer and been more comfortable in doing that. You could actually stay in half an hour longer at night than you could during the day because it was so much cooler. And I think aircon would have improved the patient care, as would just simple things like observation cameras. So the survivors had a rough time. They were often stigmatised, and many were orphaned and had ongoing legacy health issues, which I think have been widely studied since, but neurological damage as a result of the Ebola infection seems to be a common feature, along with eye problems, joints, etc. The legacy for the healthcare workers was fairly devastating, and very few of the doctors survived. I think there are about 12 left in Sierra Leone at the end of the epidemic, and a couple of those have since died from road traffic accidents in tragic circumstances. 500 deaths amongst other healthcare workers. And the community clinic that was the health structure really of the country completely collapsed. And the ironic situation we found was that many of our colleagues who we work with in the treatment centre were actually out of work when the treatment centre closed, and you'd think, having lost so many healthcare workers, that they would all be straight back in a job. But because the structure had collapsed as well, many of them were out of work, and if they couldn't get jobs with other NGOs, then they were in trouble with rent and stopping being evicted, and also provide medication for them and their families when they become sick because they've been continuously out of work. The situation is slowly improving, but the international interest ongoing once the Ebola died down seemed to sort of evaporate virtually overnight. This cartoon, I think, summarises perhaps better than many words do of what the underlying problem is with poverty in the third world, with well-meaning and important finances coming into the country through charitable funds, through overseas development funding, etc. Whilst beneath their feet we are pilfering their natural resources in a massive way. And Sierra Leone is a very resource-rich country. I mean, you'll all be familiar with the story of the Blood Diamonds and things which contributed to the Civil War, but they do have other things as well. One of the nurses came up to me one day and said, Dr. Dave, can you help me? I've got this bad pain in my hip, and I've noticed him limping once or twice. And I asked a few simple questions, didn't have x-rays available or anything, but I said to him, I'm pretty sure you've probably got osteoarthritis in that hip. Your chances of getting a hip replacement? That's zero. Yet, titanium is one of the main exports from Sierra Leone. They have some of the biggest natural reserves of titanium in the world, and it's quite likely, it is certainly finding its way into our hip and knee joint replacements that we all kind of take for granted these days. One of the probably most important aspects of this is to try and improve transparency in the international extractive industry. And there's been an international body trying to do that since June 2003. And in 2016, led in part by President Obama and David Cameron, the legislation was strengthened to include payments made to government officials in third world countries in order to secure the rights to extract minerals, oil, timber, etc. From these countries. This was met with quite a lot of international opposition, particularly from the oil companies. Surprise there. But it's an aim to improve the governance and reduce corruption in this sector. And Sierra Leone is in fact a member of one of the 52 member countries. However, according to the source BBC News, media freedom in Sierra Leone has its limits. And media rights monitors say high-level corruption is a taboo topic for journalists out there, with officials using libel laws to target errant journalists. And then there's the Donald Trump effect. One of the few laws signed by President Trump has eliminated a critical anti-corruption rule, i.e. the 2016 amendment, that improved transparency in the opaque natural resources sector. It's a gift to kleptocrats around the world and to players in the US oil industry as stuck in the past. The US is abdicating leadership in the global fight against corruption. This is a major backward step in improving the poverty situation in the third world, where it's estimated that less than 10% of these payments in many countries finds its way back into funding infrastructure and improvements in the social well-being of the nation. That's why it's important, because publishing the billions of dollars in payments made to these governments worldwide will equip the journalists and other citizens in these resource-rich nations to fight the corruption and improve the accountability of their own politicians and leaders. So in summary, if you go to work out in the third world, and by all means please do, expect to feel frustrated, expect to feel inadequate, and be ready to find blatant discrimination and poverty. And I was quite shocked by how poor Sierra Leone was. Many people living there still live in what were originally refugee camps that have become townships, but they still don't have proper sanitation. Even schools don't have proper toilets out there in many cases. You can't change the world alone, but you can make a difference. And money isn't the only answer to these problems. Money is obviously at the core of it, but the sort of initiatives that we're talking about today are incredibly important, because you can put the money in there, but without the training, without the leadership, without the experience and the knowledge, and without adequate numbers of healthcare workers with those skills out there, the situation isn't going to improve. So please carry on. Thank you.